Welcome to the Daily Dev Talk with me, Adrian Nanchev, where we explore and share experiences, stories, and lessons 7 days a week from across the games industry, helping you make the best game you can. Stay tuned for today's episode. Good morning, Overload Nation. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Dev Talk, talking to game developers from across the world to bring you experiences, stories, and lessons 7 days a week. Today, I am joined with John Dadley from Sea Green Games to talk about his first game, Stage Presence. John, tell us about yourself first and how you got into the games industry.
Hey Adrian, I'm John. I've been in the games industry for about 8 years now. I've worked at a lot of big studios in the UK. I went straight out of university as a coder, and then I moved into design, which has served me really well. You know, being a designer who can also code and actually make things happen is incredibly useful on indie projects. You know, where you have to wear a lot of hats and do a lot of different roles. I'm still in the big games industry, I guess you could call it, or the mainstream games industry, but I'm just now starting to branch out into indie work, and Stage Presence is the first kind of venture into that.
Cool. So, what led you to work onto Stage Presence then? Just a cool idea you had for a long time, or you were just fiddling around with ideas? Or how did it happen?
Yeah, it kind of was that. It originally started off as a virtual reality project. And it was around the time that VR was starting to pick up a couple of years ago, and a lot of people were getting interested in it. And initially, I just wanted to experiment with VR, and I had this initial idea for it, and it just kind of snowballed out of that. Originally, I released a prototype version of the game last year, and enough people were interested in it, and there was enough kind of attention around it that I thought, you know, there's something here. So I decided to kind of expand it out, and it kind of took on a life of its own, really. I'd never really expected it to get to this point, but it's just kind of happened. It's been such an enjoyable process that, you know, it's kind of become a monster in a way.
Yes, VR has really changed a lot and
Mm.
has a lot of potential. I think at the moment it's too bulky
Oh,
and
absolutely, yeah.
it's potentially too expensive. One side note about VR is whenever people talk about VR, what comes to mind really is the scene from Back to the Future 2 where they're in the family of the future and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
future daughter is with the VR. That always comes to mind.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, no, indeed. Yeah, I mean, VR has got a long way to go yet, but I think for me personally, that's one of the most exciting things about it is that there are so many unknowns. It's kind of a wild west at the moment, you know, and we're inventing the rules, and that's one of the things that's been so enjoyable about this project actually is discovering all these rules and what you can
Mm,
and can't do. Whereas a lot of standard gaming has already been mapped in, you know, in terms of its design.
exactly, where status quo has been changed.
Indeed, absolutely. And,
Mm.
and you know, as a designer, that's one of the most fascinating things. You know,
Exactly. When when the status quo has changed, it's a whole new different ball game.
indeed.
So tell me about Sea Green Games. Is it a one-man band at the moment, or how's it structured and how many people? What's happening exactly?
So it is largely me, but one of the useful things about being in the games industry is there's a lot of very talented people I've been able to call in to help with this. There's a surprising amount of dialogue in the game. There's a band manager who instructs you on your progress and tells you how to improve. There's also the audience who heckle back at you. A large amount of that script was written by a writer friend of mine who worked in the games industry for some time. Also, the music was done by a musician friend of mine, and just the amount of feedback from other artists and designers that I work with, that advice has been absolutely invaluable. Although they're not formal members of the company, you know, that stuff is incredibly useful, and you know, some of the biggest parts of the game have come from that external help. So.
Well, that just proves that it's about who you know as opposed to what you know, and the importance of networking as
Oh,
well.
absolutely. I mean, it's one of these things as well that you can't really predict. You know, a lot of people who you might have known years ago will suddenly pop up and they'll become incredibly important. And it really is incredibly vital to know people and, you know, have a wide. I think that's been one of the huge learning points of this project. Actually, for me, was it's easy to be precious about your own ideas and kind of feel that you could do everything on your own, but you'd be amazed how much just talking to other people, even not necessarily people in the games industry. You know, I've had some great inspiration from from just fans of the game, and it's amazing how much just collaborating with other people will, bring so much more than you ever really could achieve on your own.
Yes, I'm currently going through a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and he's talking about all sorts of business theory and psychology and stuff like that. And one idea is about the idea of mastermind and being with other people
Mm,
in union with the perfect harmony towards a single goal and a single desire
right.
with
Yeah.
a defined plan. So that is amazing to see it still in action as regards to getting game ideas being spreading and other people talking and bouncing ideas, improving things through dialogue and innovation just through talking to people and networking.
Absolutely, it's something that still surprises me even in my day-to-day work. You'd think after 8 years of this, I'd have been more aware of it, but even now, you'd be surprised how much of the major design in a game is actually done in the kitchen when you're just talking to people, and you'll be stuck on a problem, and you'll mention it to someone who isn't as close to the problem as you, and they'll just come up with a simple solution immediately, and it's amazing how often that happens. And it isn't necessarily, because they're some genius designer or even a designer at all, but it just can be that they're removed from the problem, and that distance can be, incredibly important.
I understand, yes. So let's talk about the game
Mm.
and stage presence. What is it you wanted the player to experience?
So it's kind of an unusual game in that one of the big emotions I want to evoke with it is kind of vulnerability and social awkwardness initially in the game. So the premise of the game is that you and your band are playing a festival, a music festival, and you're like the lead singer in the band, which is a position of power. It's quite an authoritative position to be in. But about 10 seconds into the game, all your band's equipment fails, and you're the only person with a working microphone. And the game's driven through your microphone and your voice. And I wanted to put the player into that kind of vulnerable position. A lot of people have a fear of crowds or public address and things like that. So I wanted to start you off in a position of power and then kind of take that away. But then the whole point of the game, you win the crowd over again. So it's all about really kind of earning that power and authority, because a lot of games can be about wish fulfillment or power fantasies. And I think it's interesting to play with that and kind of toy with that concept. So that's what I want from the game initially is, kind of an awkwardness and a vulnerability, and then for the player to really feel like they've earned back the authority that's taken away from them.
Oh wow, that's a lot deeper than I anticipated. That's really deep. To be honest, I didn't feel that awkwardness. It was just like, hey, we're on stage. There's a problem.
Sure.
So I didn't see it that way. 'Cause I see it like the audience perceive you,
Mm.
the band, both individually and as a whole, in the context of the scenario that the audience give the band their attention and their respect because they're listening to them.
Yeah.
And if there's a problem with tech, then suddenly it's like there's just a technical delay, a blip, not a catastrophe.
Sure.
It's like the authority's still there,
Yeah.
but it's just like, hey, it's delayed. Like when a train is delayed or a car stuck in traffic,
Yeah.
something beyond their control. But the context still shows that they still have that power.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I had to kind of caricature the game slightly, and that in, as you say, a real life audience would be a lot more forgiving, I think. Although, I've seen footage from some festivals that doesn't necessarily say that's true. But um, as well, the game, was designed for VR originally, and one of the original intentions was to see whether you can induce the kind of the panicky feeling that someone would feel in front of a crowd in VR just by presenting them with a large audience. And the jury's still out on that one a little bit. It turned out to be a lot more of a complicated issue than I thought, but there's been an interesting range of reactions to the game so far. Like I've had some people just watch the videos and feel like tense and nervous just watching videos of other people playing. And then, as you say, other people can actually feel quite engaged, and they could, like, I've had people who almost thrive off the situation, which is interesting. I think those tend to be more kind of outgoing people, and that's something I completely hadn't predicted about the game at all. And I think that's another interesting thing is about design is you can have all the ideas in the world, but then when you actually put something out there and see people playing it, your expectations, 9 times out of 10 don't actually play out in reality.
Yeah, I understand that. Just it's different on paper. Easier said than done.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, when it came to promoting the game, how did you go about it, and what worked well and what didn't work so well?
So this was an interesting thing. Initially last year, when I released the original prototype of the game, I did almost no promotion for it, and then it kind of took on a life of its own because a few semi-prominent YouTubers picked up on it. A guy called Kasich Games, another guy, Hank with Games or Games with Hank, I think, and then Best in Slot, and they picked up on the game and put some videos out there, and then suddenly it was getting a hell of a lot of attention, and I'd never even approached them about this. And it was kind of surprising because I hadn't put any effort in, and now the games, I've started to put the effort into the game. It's surprising how when you actually start approaching people, like with the YouTubers, for instance, it's been a lot harder to get that attention out. It seems like the organic stuff uh, is the way to go with that. You almost can't force it in a way. But then traditional media has been a big surprise. Like I was really surprised how easy it is to get articles on relatively prominent publications like Rock Paper Shotgun and Eurogamer. If you have an interesting concept, something that's a bit original or a bit different, it really is just a case of sending an email. And I'd always assumed that it was a case of, oh, you've got to know someone, or you've got to have a huge PR or marketing department, and you've got to work at a major publisher. But it really turns out that isn't the case. If you've got something that's interesting, that's a bit different, then these places are happy to hear from you and put your stuff out there. So that was a huge surprise for me.
That's funny how you should mention that. Funny how you should mention that, John. Actually, because I was doing a few of the interviews today for previous episodes earlier on, and I had the idea of approaching some of publications, Rock Paper Shotgun, for example, and talking to them about, hey, I got Daily Dev Talk, talking to game developers 7 days a week, sharing stories, lessons, experiences. How cool is that? Let's get together for an interview, something like that. So I had that idea, but I had the idea, but I never really thought about it before.
Yeah,
So it's just funny you should mention that through organic and through media. Just interesting.
Yeah, I think specifically the more kind of social medias are harder to not control, but to influence. I think they seem to be a lot more organic, whereas the more traditional media, kind of magazine style websites, they seem more open to you approaching them and presenting them with content, which it kind of isn't what I expected in a way. I almost expected it to be the reverse, because you think of kind of things like YouTube as being more homegrown. So I thought they would have been more receptive, but it's an interesting experience. It's still something I'm learning at the moment, definitely.
I understand. So how did you go about funding the game, and what worked well and what didn't work so well?
So funding so far, to my bank balance's great astonishment, has been almost entirely out of my back pocket at this point, which has been interesting because it's kind of been a case of a death by a thousand cuts, I think is the expression. Because as the project has snowballed, I've incrementally had to buy more and more assets and resources and hire people, and that's which has been good as well, because there's been very little kind of wasted resources in that respect, in that I've always known exactly what I needed, and I've just paid for the things that I've needed, as opposed to hiring an artist to work for 60 days and then there might be downtime or time when they're not doing things. Whereas, the actual mainstream games industry can be very stop-start in the way games are developed. People have downtime, they're not always constantly working, whereas on this, I've always known exactly what I needed, and I just get it commissioned and just get it done. But on the other hand, being one person and being self-funded, video games, even something as relatively simple as a stage presence, and quite a small self-encapsulated thing, it's amazing how the prices really start to rack up. And money hasn't been my main motivation for this, but I'm hoping with the Steam release in a couple of months' time, I'm hoping that if we could get development costs back and maybe something on top of that, then I could look into this as a bigger venture and make other games and fund those from the profits from this game as well. I mean, that's the dream, really.
Hmm. Ah, I get you. And speaking of the dream, what was cut from the game and why?
So I think again because this has been a project that I've been able to direct myself with very little kind of external pressure. There hasn't been a huge amount that's been cut really. There were some ideas at the start, like originally when it was a VR experience at the very, very start when I had the initial idea, there wasn't really any tension in the game. Originally, it was just going to be a pure, almost kind of wish fulfillment experience. You're on a stage and you can see all these people and they're shouting your name and that kind of name in lights feeling. But I think it was my designer brain it kind of kicked in and said, well, there's no tension here. There's nothing for the player to overcome. There's no obstacle. There's nothing to learn. So, in a way, the actual original game idea itself got cut or kind of evolved into something else. And funnily enough, the when I released the original prototype of the game, a lot of people actually asked for that mode, and now the game actually features that original idea, but as a separate game mode because people did just want an experience where they could just go out and soak up the crowd, especially in VR, where that's a much more powerful experience than just on a flat monitor. So that was interesting. I did have some ideas to kind of take the same idea but extend it in a different avenue. Like at one point, I was thinking about maybe instead of being on a stage, you were a court jester, and every instead of just disappointing an audience, you had the king's executioner would slowly be coming towards you every time you bored the king. So you were fighting for your life in essence, and eventually he'd get so close to you that he'd kill you. But the problem with that was that it was incredibly asset heavy, and being a one man guy, although it's kind of an interesting idea, it would be a complete revamp in terms of assets that I can't personally make. So
That's understandable, but I think with the executioner, it would have been a bit more funny if the character had been beheaded, not just
yeah,
saw the
absolutely.
body.
Well, it's interesting actually. There was a really cool VR demo. I think it was about a year ago now that simulated the an execution, and the idea was the player actually put their head down, and in the real world, timed in with the graphics in the game, someone would hit your neck without you being aware that they were going to do it. So you got this kind of sense of something from the real world bleeding over into the game world. There's been some great videos of people playing that on YouTube and having very intense reactions to it. But again, the problem with that is you actually have to have someone in the real world to actually perform the mock execution, which unfortunately I can't bundle myself with every copy of the game.
Wow, okay, I forgot about that bit where someone actually hit them, but yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that, and that's why I thought that'd be quite cool to mix that in. Plus, also, I also imagined a open night mic where you're on your own and you have to do like a comedy show,
Oh right. Okay.
but with a varying size of audience. There's some awkwardness for you. In fact,
Absolutely.
you may as well just scrap the whole thing and rebrand it as like Awkward Simulator or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean that was kind of a running joke actually, was the idea that it's a game that's because as I say, most games are designed to make you feel powerful, and this is kind of the complete opposite. I really like that idea actually for an open mic. 'Cause I've been to a few open mic nights, which they've been some of the most uncomfortable experiences of my entire life. I mean, I think when you go to like you were saying earlier, actually, when you go to something like this, the audience is captive in a sense in that they want the person to succeed. Generally, no one wants to
Mm.
see anyone fail publicly. Uh, so when you see someone performing and it not necessarily being their strong suit, it creates a really weird tension in the audience, which is actually something I'm exploring with the multiplayer mode for this game that's being worked on for the Steam release. Um, I'm really interested to see how this is going to play out. So the idea with this is that if you go into multiplayer, so when anyone's playing the single player game, their game can be sort of invaded, almost like a Dark Souls game, and the multiplayers will come in as members of the crowd, and there's voice chat between. So the people in the crowd, can hear what the player on stage is saying, and the person on stage can hear what the people who've come in through multiplayer in the crowd are saying as well. And I'm really interested to see how people take to that, because there's always an element on the internet in games where people anonymity allows people to be less compassionate, I think, than they would be in real life. But I'm interested to see if virtual reality, if you're a member of the crowd in VR and you almost feel like you really are seeing someone up on stage. I'm really curious to see if that will kind of bring people's compassion and humanity back, or if they will just love the chance to heckle someone over the internet.
So suddenly it's become Troll Simulator as well.
Well, this is kind of the experiment. I'm interested to see what direction it goes in, and I'm going to support the game a lot after the release, because if it does go to one's extreme over the other, then I'm going to see what I can do to kind of even the odds for the person on the stage.
Hmm.
Because I wouldn't want it. I mean, the tension there in the game is winning the audience back. But if someone can come back in multiplayer and just troll you relentlessly through the entire game, I mean, that's not fun for anyone really. So it's going to take a lot of play testing and seeing how people actually take to the game.
Oh, definitely, I understand that. And uh, what was the biggest thing you learned while working on the game?
I think, as I was saying earlier, collaboration, it really surprised me how, when I was, because when you work in the games industry, or I think anyone who enjoys making games in any job, everyone has that feeling of, oh, I've got the perfect idea, and if I just had the time, and if I just did everything how I wanted to do it, it would be perfect. And even having worked in the games industry for so long and knowing how important collaboration is, I fell victim to that a bit with this project. So it really surprised me, and it was a bit of a wake up call for me to realize that, oh, actually, even if you work solely on your own and you can execute all these ideas that seem perfect in your head, actually, a lot of your strongest work will come from talking to other people and being inspired by them. And it's really, really reaffirmed for me just how important collaboration is, which is interesting given that I'm, currently setting up a one-man studio. It's now, I think, going to put a lot of emphasis for me on collaboration, despite, just being a one-man operation.
Mm, interesting. So, what was the worst thing that happened, and how did you overcome it?
So, as I said earlier, I think knowing what I know now and being where I am now, actually properly releasing the game as a full product, I quite regret releasing the initial prototype of the game. At the time, it seemed really exciting and like a really big thing for me, because it was getting all this exposure and all this attention and press. But it was also, an unpolished, really quite ugly prototype. And the problem is now that Google is filled with images and videos of this really, really ropey prototype. And now, if if you Google for stage presence, the first thing you get tends to be this horrible, really ugly looking prototype compared to how the game looks now. So I'm still overcoming this now, trying to get the game out there and getting more press. Like we've had the Rock Paper Shotgun in the Eurogame. I think that's helped quite a lot. But the last thing I want is that when someone looks at my game, the first thing they see is this gaudy, Unity looking game. So that's still a problem, and it's still something we're overcoming. And in hindsight, I probably wouldn't have released that prototype. But if I hadn't, then I wouldn't be where I am now. So.
Interesting. It's a learning experience, and
Mm,
it's a new one as well.
mm.
So, what was the best game dev purchase you made? Whether it was a software license, a top quality piece of hardware or equipment, or simply a comfortable chair and a good desk.
Well, a comfortable chair is vitally important, and it's something I need to get at the moment, because most of my indie work's done at home on the sofa, which really is not the ideal place to develop a game. But in terms of
Mm.
actual purchases, I mean, aside from the Unity Pro license, which I don't think is as important for small indie developers anymore, now that the personal edition does pretty much everything Unity Pro does. But I don't regret getting that. I think the biggest and most important purchase for me has been the Oculus Dev Kit. That has changed a lot of the way that I look at design and what a game can be, and what an experience can be as well. Like I think I used to be quite dismissive of what I used to call low content games. Things that weren't strictly mechanics and systems, and And now I see there's a lot more room for that with things like the Oculus. Like we were saying earlier, it really has. It's a whole new ball game. It's a different kettle of fish, and it isn't. I I think a lot of people are worried about. Oh well, the Oculus isn't going to replace games, and I don't think it is going to replace games. I think it's going to become its own thing in much the same way that cinema didn't replace books because they're two separate entities. They both exist and do different things, and that was why that was such an important purchase for me because it really opened my eyes as to what VR is and what it can be, and the sort of things that I wanted to design and I wanted to develop and share with people. Because I don't think I would have ended up here now talking to you if I hadn't got that kit and if I hadn't kind of pushed myself to learn about what's possible in this new kind of design space.
One thing I'm planning on doing when Game Overload is quite big is to start my own game studio.
Mm.
And one idea I have is that if you wouldn't play the game, you wouldn't pay for the game, or certainly the consumer wouldn't pay for the game.
Oh, absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. I think this is something that not worries me a bit, but something that one of the strong areas with stage presence for me is that it's been something that even when I think about the concept now, it makes me smile. And I think if I saw it on Steam, I'd go, "Hey, that's kind of that's a novel, interesting idea." Whereas I've seen a lot of people I know who have, and you see this a lot in the major games industry. People doing kind of pale imitations of existing successful ideas, and I think it's sad because when I see that I love Minecraft. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Minecraft, and it's a great game, a great experience. But I see a lot of people cynically copying it, and I think they probably enjoy Minecraft as well. But I do wonder if by just copying something that already exists, if they're really getting the best out of what they could do. So, yeah.
Well, I understand, but I think two things to consider when it comes to that. One, great artists don't copy, they steal.
Yes, I completely agree, yes.
And two, the marketplace's ideas will determine the outcome of that game. So if it's a carbon copy and more or less identical, the audience don't buy it. They vote with their pounds or the dollars or euros, wherever you're listing from, and so the game goes nowhere.
No, I completely agree. Especially as you were saying that great artists steal. There's a fantastic documentary series called "Everything's a Remix" about how there are essentially no original ideas. Every great idea really is taking something that existed before and putting a new twist on it or a new spin on it. And I completely agree with that. But I think my feeling on it is that there are people who, I think if they were doing something that they really cared about themselves, that was more passion driven rather than just going, this is something I enjoyed before, can I recreate it? If they were going more something, is this idea something that if I saw it would excite me rather than something, I don't know, maybe I'm not articulating this properly, but I think people would be driven more by an original idea than something that they've already experienced in terms of their own development, because I think it's too easy to fall into tropes when you're imitating something else. Not that, there isn't a lot of value in imitation, especially for learning. I think if you're practicing something, imitating something that already exists is a great way of learning why that thing works or why it doesn't work. And I think that's a really useful tool for practicing your skills. And as you say, there's a lot of great ideas that have come from imitating or evolving other ideas.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I agree. So, John, like, what game development related book, lecture, or learning resource can you recommend?
So I generally try and steer clear of textbooks. I've read a lot of design books over the years, and very few of them have tended to fully ring true. I mean, there's generally good ideas here and there throughout them, but I've never really found one that's really sung to me. I do think the GDC Vault is a brilliant resource for designers and for every discipline, actually. And I think one of the reasons that works is for the same reason that this podcast works, because when you have someone who has a real world example of something, a real experience, and they can relate that practical experience to you, there's a lot more value in that than more abstract philosophizing, which is harder to relate to. And as I was saying earlier, it's easy to have ideas, but 9 times out of 10, when they when they actually hit development, they fall apart. When they get into the player's hand, it may not work out like you imagined it. So I tend to put a lot more stock in, seeing a GDC talk from someone at Naughty Dog talking about the iteration on The Last of Us or something like that, because you know how that relates to the real world. That's gone through the mill of games development. Whereas, books tend to, although, a lot of good books do have real world examples, they tend to be more abstract than that. And I don't know how much I trust that. For smaller indie devs as well, the Game Dev Reddit is a really, really fantastic resource. I've found a massive amount of indie resources in terms of assets and information that I would never have found on my own. Just through people discussing. It's fantastic. It really is.
I think if you look carefully through the Game Dev Reddit, you will find a post or two by me talking about Daily Dev Talk.
Funnily enough, the very day that I spoke to you about this, I'd seen you post on the Reddit. I even gave you an upvote. So yes, I did see you on there.
Brilliant! Oh, brilliant! But the thing is, I hadn't known about it until like the day before or something.
Oh, really? Oh, you should definitely subscribe. It really is a fantastic resource for developers. It really is. It's very good.
Yeah, I'm gonna post more or less every episode on there as well to get more traffic, more people hearing. So hopefully, it'll be pretty cool. And the GDC Vault, that sounds pretty cool. Can you tell a little bit more about that? Do you say it's every subject, every discipline, and is it tutorials or is it linked or just what exactly is it?
So the GDC Vault is collections of videos and slideshows and sometimes just audio transcripts from developers who've given talks at the Game Developer Conference. Now, the newest talks tend to be behind a paywall, but there is a lot of free content on there from a couple of years ago, and they cover every discipline. You'll have people talking about AI, people talking about design, art, and it's great because it can be about obscure subjects that you would never really have thought you had an interest in. For instance, there was I think I referenced a minute ago, there was a great talk from Naughty Dog about the AI development of Ellie in The Last of Us. Now, I don't really have a huge interest in AI or know much about the subject, and it was an AI heavy talk. But it was absolutely fascinating, and it's incredibly useful, I think, to get that kind of cross-pollination from subjects that you wouldn't normally be interested in, because you might get ideas or concepts that will become useful to you later on in your development, especially if you're a smaller indie dev who has to wear many hats. And the amount of different areas I've had to learn about, it's been incredibly useful to have that resource.
That's amazing. Always one for learning. And like an Evernote or a Trello, do you have a useful or productivity enhancing software, app, extension, or website worth sharing?
So I do use Evernote for making notes when I'm on the go. If you have that brilliant idea when you're walking down the street, it's really useful to have that there. But honestly, I think the most useful resource for me, and it's been this way for years, maybe I'm just old school, is a notepad and pen. That for me is more useful because it forces you to always be aware of what you've got to do. If you have a notepad on your desk, it's not like a website which is tucked away or an app that you've got to open and actively go to. That to-do list is always in the corner of your eye. You always know that, there's that thing I really need to be getting on with, and I could just go on the internet or play a game, but it's always there in the corner of your eye, and it's always focusing your attention. And I think it's just a bit too easy with productivity apps to just not open them or go to the site. So I tend to prefer using a notepad and pen. And I always have a to-do list because I think that can really focus you. When you sit down and okay, I'm going to do 3 hours of work in this free time I've got. And it can be easy if you don't have a to-do list to just aimlessly putter about and maybe tweak some visual effect and not really do anything productive. But when you order your thoughts in a to-do list, you know exactly what you've got to do. And when you sit down, you can see, okay, here's this thing that I might have been putting it off, but it needs to be done, and it's important and it's vital. Whereas it's a lot easier to ignore those things and be unfocused without a to-do list. So I really think that's a really vital skill.
Yeah, that's what I use a lot. In fact, I tend to take it one step beyond, and I use Notepad on the computer and just write all the notes down and just store it elsewhere. And sometimes I use all sorts of other ways of using Notepad, like for basic emails and such.
Absolutely.
And I tried Evernote once or twice, and I didn't see the point because what I tend to do is on my iPhone, just do a reminder or a note. Just write it all down, and then write it all down at say 1 p.m. and then I say, okay, at 6 p.m. I will be at computer. Let's set a reminder at 6 p.m. So let's say research such and such. Reminder set for 6 p.m. So 6 p.m. Okay. Google Chrome, Control T, type it in, enter, take it from there.
I do. Yes, I do a fair amount of that as well. I've got a library of past reminders for things like that on my phone as well. I mean, Evernote, it's really more just because the kind of the cloud-based nature of it. It's useful to know that I can access those notes from my home PC, or if I'm on my girlfriend's laptop or over at a friend's house showing them something and I need to pull up the note, it's useful to just always have that there, even though I generally, have my phone with me. So that's really, but as I say, I don't really use it that much. I prefer the physical notepad and pen, really.
I understand. So what advice can you give to aspiring game developers, small indie studios, and people trying to get to where you are today?
I think I've touched on this a little bit before, but I really think try and be as distinctive and true to yourself as possible. People will appreciate if your personality comes through in your work more, rather than just trying to sterilely imitate someone else. I think people will appreciate that a lot more, and I think you'll find it a lot more satisfying. On a more kind of practical level, I think practice really is, it's kind of a cliche, but it really does make perfect. And with that, I think you have to bring a certain amount of humility as well. I remember when I was first starting out, when I was in university, you have that kind of bravado where you go, I know everything. I know what would make a really good design. And you make your first game or your first level or your first mod or something, and it's terrible because everyone's first attempt at most skill-based things is terrible. Very few people can instantly become proficient at something. So I think you have to bring that humility to it and know that you're going to have to practice, and your first thing or your 10th attempt might be terrible. But you've just got to know that if you keep honing your skills, if you keep learning, if you keep practicing, that you will become skilled and you will be able to make the things that you kind of imagine in your head, and you'll be able to do them far better than you can when you first start out.
Yes, I agree. 10,000 hours.
Yes.
So what is next for you, and what's the best way to contact you?
So for me, I'm going to see how Stage Present plays out. It's kind of a difficult one to know how this will be received, I think, because it is such an unusual idea. It's been getting a positive reaction so far, but as I said earlier, if this does well on Steam, then I'm going to keep pushing some new ideas, develop those, see if they go anywhere, and hopefully, I can keep making a few weird games a year and maybe build a bit of a fan base. If people want to get in contact with me, probably through the Stage Presence Facebook page or through itch.io. Sea Green Games is on there, so you can contact me through that.
Okay. Well, John, it appears that we're out of time for this episode of the Daily Dev Talk, episode 28 as well, so that's pretty cool. It was great talking to you. A lot to take in mind, a lot to consider for the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned, Overload Nation. More videos to come. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Daily Dev Talk with me, Adrian Nanchev. If you are a game developer that wants to get your name and game out there and to share your experiences and stories, or you have feedback or opinions of the show, then contact me at info@gameoverload.co.uk. That's info@gameoverload.co.uk. Stay tuned for tomorrow's episode, more to come.